Okay, so let's get to it. I'm really excited to initiate our conversation. And I'd like to kick off our discussion today. We're going to try and keep things free flowing, but if we could each take a minute or two to just give we described this last night at dinner as our superhero origin story. So how did we kind of come to this work in this field? And if we could just each talk for a minute or two each. And who wants to go first?
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll take this up for clarity. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm very happy to be on such a distinguished panel. Laura was on my dissertation committee. She's one of my mentors, so it feels very full circle. So I went to USC American Studies and Ethnicity to pursue my doctoral studies, thinking that I was going to write about Mexicans specifically in Arkansas. And it was something, I'm a first generation college student, working poor. So my parents always encouraged us to go to school, like college, but I didn't even know that graduate school was a thing that people did. But my family had moved from California, which is where I'd grown up, to Arkansas when I was 16. And let's just say it was like a rude awakening. It was a culture shock. And by the time I was wrapping up undergrad in Arkansas, I was like, I have to get out of here. But also, I don't understand how migrating 1,500 miles east made me go from like being Mexican and being seen as Mexican and treated as Mexican in and around LA to being seen as Vietnamese, which is often what people guessed I was in Arkansas in the mid-90s. And oftentimes people, when I share this anecdote, they're like, how is that possible? Well, in Arkansas in the 90s, the only non-Black, non-white groups were Southeast Asians. And so they looked at me and they just assumed that I was Vietnamese. I was there long enough in Arkansas to live through the shift of like a racialized scare of illegal aliens coming in and they're this and they're that. And so I saw the discourse kind of grow. So my arrival into graduate school and eventually into Latinx studies was definitely through seeking to understand my own experience of the way that race, racialization, the way that works, even though I didn't have that concept as an undergraduate student, and really trying to understand then how Arkansans responded to my family and that cohort of migration in the mid-90s, but also how that experience was defined in relationship to two prior groups that had arrived in Arkansas. Cubans in 1980 from the Port of Mariel and Vietnamese refugees in 1975. And so, I think so many works in ethnic studies, it was seeking to understand my own community. Yes, my experience, but ultimately, what does it mean to be Latinx in Arkansas, right? In the U.S. South.
Hello. Thanks, everybody, for coming to this discussion. So I'm happy to go after you because I'm older, and so I lived through different generations. And I grew up in Southern California in the LA area. And I remember very early on a couple of things in my life. One is trying to understand the segregation patterns in LA, like why do all Mexicans live one place, the Black people live here, and Asians. I live in San Pedro, but I remember seeing concentrations of Japanese there, and just trying to figure out what that all meant. And then I also remember, I was born in 1962, and I remember through the civil rights era, all the focus, of course, on Black people and anti-Black racism, and just wondering well, this is all good, but where do we fit in all this? And there was no language, there was no kind of clear, at least to me as a child, movements and activism that I could understand. So I've always been on a quest to try to understand who we are, and in the case of the ethnic Mexican population, who we are and how we fit into a larger racial formation and how those different kinds of racial dynamics work, including us also being perpetrators of white supremacy at times. So that's where my work kind of came from.
So I'll also signal my age. Just 40 years before Laura in Cuba. And we left when I was 5 years old. And rather than settle in South Florida, luckily we went to Southern California. And so I grew up in Los Angeles in the 60s, even though a million students left the island, about 50,000 ended up in LA. But that's a drop in the bucket in LA, right? So nobody knows that actually happened, but we were part of that migration. And so I couldn't speak English when I was 5 years old, when I started kindergarten at a public kindergarten in the San Gabriel Valley in the middle of working class immigrant, LA. And so, I think that's part of the origin story, right? Is sort of, because I'm a lit person, so all my degrees are in English, and I very much sort of grounded in literary studies. But that origin story begins with a kid who spoke no English going to before there were ESL classes at all, right? Being sort of plunged into an English speaking world at school when I was 5 years old. What saved my life was reading. I just loved it. And I just was a reader from the very beginning. Comic books to begin with, but then, detective stories, blah, 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 just like genres growing up through high school and then into college. And yeah, so it started with that. So all the other sort of things that we've already heard my amazing colleagues talk about, and that I know that this conversation is going to be primarily about, we're always there, but for me, it felt like in a different way, right? Like the whole idea of the transition from one language to another, and the transition into a kind of reading life could have happened to anybody in any language, right? That's something that has a kind of almost a neutral content to it in a way, but it's structural. Of course, it's all sort of driven by power, because these two languages don't have a mutual relationship to one another, and didn't in Southern California in the 60s, and have never had historically ever. When we're talking about English and Spanish, right? And so that starts something. And then all the other questions about Latinidad as an identity, as a cultural formation, as a racial formation, as an object of study in whatever way we're thinking about it today. I mean, I came to this study, relatively speaking, late, because it was my intention even going into grad school, because it was still such a nascent field in the mid-'80s that I thought it was going to do fairly canonical British, US, Anglophone lit. But I found a home in this thing called critical theory. And so even though I ended up writing, and I'll just say this, a dissertation on an 18th century British novel called Tom Jones by a writer named Henry Fielding, that dissertation was really mostly about post-structuralism and sort of post-structural Marxist feminist deconstructions of everything that I could sort of like push through this reading of this really weird long novel. and so I ended up experiencing kind of a dissertation fatigue for that moment. And this was in the early 90s. And I looked around and I thought, what am I going to do the rest of my career? Am I really going to sort of keep pushing at like the canon, right? And some part of me realized I needed a refresher. So I started like just reading a lot of queer Latinx literature that was starting to come up in the world. And I realized, I can leave the canon behind. I'll keep theory. And I'm just going to try to do this other thing for the rest of my career. That's how that started.
Thank you for being here, everyone. I also have connections to everyone at this table in different ways. Among them, the very first presentation that I gave to a graduate student. And Ricardo was there to witness the catastrophic failure that was that presentation. And here I am, continuing. He was very cordial. So my interest in Latinx studies grew out of my interest in, as a young person, in making sense of the kind of dynamic relations of race, culture, and place that shaped my hometown. I grew up in an agricultural region in Northern California that experienced significant economic, socio-political, and most importantly, demographic shifts in the 1980s and 90s. So what was once a region made up of predominantly white people in small farms and ranches became, within a period of 10 years, a predominantly Mexican community. And the kind of founding of the wine country created all of these new racial, economic, and social antagonisms. And I was interested in making sense of that. And one thing I just would have put out there that I often share with my students that I think is very interesting in terms of how we think about racial formation. I was sharing with Perla last night that it's interesting that in my high school, which was an integrated, probably about 50% Latino, 50% white, the students that had a kind of social justice orientation, and I was among them, became very interested in the anti-apartheid movement. And I think that it's very interesting to think about the ways in which it was a way for us to express our interest in social justice work without having to deal with the elephant in the room, which was the kind of antagonisms that we experienced in this very uneven community. And so I like to think of that as something that guides my work in Latino studies, is being really reflecting on, what are the kind of antagonisms that I'm standing right in the middle of, and how do I kind of mobilize my work and what I do from that kind of.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I have to say, I was part of a genealogy of Latino studies that I didn't know I was a part of until I started teaching Latino studies for Americans. I went to grad school at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and I had the blessings of having Juan Flores as my professor. And he had just finished his 3 years of directing the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. So it's interesting that you talked about your biography. He did German studies and switched to cultural studies and moved into what he called Nuyorican studies. Yeah. And so with him, I learned to look at the archives and move away from numbers and sort of the sociological logic of the more numbers you have, the more validity your data has, right? The Grad Center, being a public institution, did a lot of that grandstanding because they wanted to prove that they were doing science like anybody else. And so he was one of those faculty members where I found a home to be able to talk about questions of Latinidad in the context of being Puerto Rican, being racialized in particular ways, but still having light skin privilege. So through his course, I ended up writing a piece that gets cited a lot called From Being a White Person of Color, which looks at autoethnography and racialization through autoethnography. And he was a very important inspiration. But I also knew Lynette Cantu, who passed early on in his book, The Sexuality of Migration, was influential in how I think about Latino studies.
So I'll just say very quickly that my own formation, I mean, it's so interesting to hear everybody's personal stories because so much of the work that we do is motivated by personal work, but I think it is at some level, like, the tools that we bring are deeply analytical, right? So it's not that we're only interested in anecdotal experiences, but we're interested in sort of bringing research and methodologies to questions that are oftentimes deeply personal. And my story is more or less the same. I grew up in Florida at a time when I was the only Latino in my high school. And people were very invested in anti-Black racism and kind of didn't really know what to do with me. And then, so like my solidarities and my sort of, social networks were very kind of idiosyncratic and weird. And then I moved to California for grad school, and there I was a Puerto Rican man trained in Chicano studies, which formed its own sort of like idiosyncratic kind of thing. and was very much embraced by Chicano studies scholars and very much related to Chicano studies methodologies, but never really found myself quite at home in that space. And I remember asking the question in like the late 1990s and early 2000s, like, where are Latino studies programs? Like, well, I guess they were at Wayne State, but I didn't know that. I found myself increasingly interested in comparative work. And I remember reading articles very early in my intellectual formation from the Journal of Chicano Pequeño Studies, which was like a place where that kind of work was happening very early on, from the 1970s on. And really being able to relate to that work. So I've always been sort of like very interested in like comparative kinds of questions and thinking about race and racialization. And when I discovered like racial formation, I studied with George Lipsitz at UCSD. And when I took this seminar, my head sort of exploded and never really came back together. So I've always been deeply, deeply interested in questions that are very social sciencey, around racial formation, around social movement organizing, around, theories of identity. And, but I'm a literary scholar. And so like my objects of study tend to be theory and cultural text. So, I'm a little bit of a llama corn, I guess. But I do think that it's really interesting to think about that Latinx studies as the kind of approach that is really adaptable for all of the kinds of work that we do. And so I want to move us to some other questions, and I'm hoping that we can be a little more interrogative now. I guess the question that I'm really excited about here is to think a little bit about our early formation as scholars and what we did in the beginnings, and then how things have sort of shifted over the last couple of years. So what kinds of things have we seen shift in the field, and what kinds of things have we shifted in our own work, and those types of things? So anybody can, yeah.
Again, I think I have a different take on experience. So I was interested in grad school, I realized, by trying to link my interest in environmental issues and with Chicano studies. And nobody had really done that. So I'm trying to look through all the literature, like around environmental issues, like, well, where do they talk about race, or where do they talk about minorities, as a language at the time? And I remember thinking about people reading articles about like who uses parks. And that was about as far as one could go. And realizing, this is just, this is not happening. And so how does one begin to do that kind of work in terms of stitching together these different kinds of fields? And I started to doing that, and it was very difficult because I lacked confidence in myself, what I was doing in this project. I remember talking to somebody on my committee. I was in the geography department at UW-Madison, and this was a committee member. And I said, well, what happens in drought to like the farm workers? That's an interesting question no one's talking about. He said, well, it's not really interesting. It gets drought, they lose their jobs. So this is like such really just kind of signaling the level of work that needed to be done. And so I started doing, for my master's thesis, I looked at farm workers' experiences with pesticides in the southern San Joaquin Valley in the Kern County area. And so I did a survey, and because that's what would fly, like in the department, that kind of work. And I did it, and I got my master's degree. I thought to myself, this means nothing. To go back to your point, it was like, I came up with the questions, I came up with the framing, all of this stuff. And, when you're really in the data, this seems accurate, this does not seem accurate. And ever since then, it's like, I have to like really pay way more attention to the voices of different peoples to hear what they have to say versus like me doing the survey kind of thing. So that's some of my beginnings.
Okay, anyway. Again, I sort of said a little bit about this in my intro. So just to pick up on that story, a lot of this is really sort of historical and generational, right? So where where things were in the late 80s, early 90s when Lava and I were both in grad school at UCLA, though we didn't know each other. And again, the differences between geography and literature, right? It's just like all of this matters in this sort of interdisciplinary space that we're all in. So yeah, I think for me, it was really a question of figuring out that I'd gotten this training and that it was sort of technical in a way. I mean, I think a lot of us working in sort of literary studies and the arts in particular, right, might feel that sometimes, well, we're just sharing feelings about stories. Anybody can have feelings about stories. Why do you think we need a PhD to do that? Isn't that exclusionary? Well, whatever. Anyway, there's this whole way in which you sort of go back and forth, I think, differently than other disciplines in like, how are we a discipline? Why are we a discipline? What does it mean to be disciplinary in the thing that we do? And so, those questions are always sort of still alive in the work that I do. And I just think that, so I don't take it for granted. I didn't from the very beginning that to try to participate in the building of a different sort of project of study that, and again, let's just stipulate that certainly African-American literary studies, African-American cultural studies paved a path, right? This was the trail being blazed before our eyes in the course of certainly from the 60s on, but really in the 70s and 80s. This was the inheritance that I think a lot of these other cognitive fields received, right, in the course of those decades. And if I sort of add to this narrative or kind of from a different angle but related, right, what first feminism and then third world feminism of color, queer studies, what was then sort of still called gay and lesbian studies primarily, started to do to kind of inflect into the study of race and ethnicity, especially in the space of literature and culture. That was a really just potent place to be, a fascinating place to be in these years, in these decades. We just saw the world kind of reinvented before our eyes in really exciting ways that I think we're still sort of, happy to receive now, right? But still kind of figuring out what to do with this really remarkable gift that we got from these, these foundational figures of the past, right? So whether it's Audre Lorde or Bell Hooks or Gloria Saldúa or there's just a lot of people I could name, right? Who just were there doing the work with nothing before them, right? Or very little before them to make this possible. That was just a really exciting place to be. So I think, for someone like me, it was just picking up books that otherwise I wouldn't have picked up, but that I had a reason to read now, right? And some of these go back, I don't go back that far in the past, but a book like John Redshi's City of Night, which is early 60s, was a bestseller at its time. It's sort of a B-era kind of like Jack Kerouac on the road story, right? But where the main character is a mixed race, young brown man from El Paso, Texas, who basically courses through the United States as a male hustler. And it's very autobiographical. So he's not just sort of telling the story he made up. He's telling a story of stuff that could happen to a particular kind of person in the post-war U.S., right? Starting right after World War II through the early 60s, that very few people were studying texts like that at the time. And this isn't the only text, but it's the one that I'll use as my case study. That felt like, oh wow, there's work to be done, and not only in excavating the past, but in sort of creating a space now where writers writing now can find a home and can find a foothold, right? And so, that was sort of a moment of real kind of just a transformation, I think, in a way that I love sort of going back to and reflecting on now 30 years later. From when that moment of discovery happened for me, which was really literally my time.
Just to add to what Ricardo was saying, I think that now I'm realizing that the LA region is a gold mine in a number of ways, because so much of the scholarship that continued from what Ricardo was sharing with you, the queer color critique, which is developed by, in particular, Rob Ferguson, a sociology to abandon sociology into American studies and African American studies, rethinks racial formations as a project that is already about heteronormativity and white supremacy, right? And so he's thinking about these categories working in and through each other You might be familiar with Butler's notion of inter-articulation, who does the same with race, right? And so I think it's important to think about how I went to grad school only a few years later than before, but already had access to the products of the scholarship that I think David was part of in the 90s, that in early 2000s, that was actually just thinking about categories in a mutual constitution of race, gender, and sexuality. So, and that goes back to Guerrero, yes, and it goes back to Salvador. So I feel like there are circles that we keep coming back to in like organizing that are connected to social movements and activism today, and influence a lot of ways how I approached a project like Urban Voices with Letty Gomez this year, because we wanted to tell the untold stories of queer LGBT Latino activists in the US and PR. Because those stories are not often told. When you think about gayness, you think, even if you don't say it, of white people, right? And so to queer that notion of how we think about sexuality as a project of white gay men and race as a project that doesn't pertain to white people, but it's a project of people of color, is one of the ways in which we need to rethink even sort of the basis of the categories that we use.
So this is actually a really nice segue to the next question that I wanted us to think about, which has to do with the work that we see emerging, and the kind of exciting new approaches that we see that are happening right now. I agree that historically, like, we have our forebears and we have the people who really influenced our work, and in some ways, those people were the most cutting edge and remain that way because, like, we keep coming back to them, but in new and different ways. So I wonder if Perla or Kirstie might be interested in picking up this question about the things that you see these days that are exciting and pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I was thinking it was a perfect time to talk about some of these things, right? As everyone was kind of telling their story, it occurred to me, I made a little note that if I'm counting right, 4 of us grew up in California, 2 of us on the East Coast, 5 of us were trained on the West Coast, only 1 on the East Coast. And I think this is part of the, we're simultaneously beneficiaries. Certainly I am with Laura's work, Ruthie Gilmore's work. When I was in grad school, I didn't have to battle to convince my committee that writing about Mexicans in Arkansas and Vietnamese and Cubans was important or could offer something, right? And so then I was really able to develop my project in a particular way. And at the same time, the field, I think, has been, although like Puerto Ricans and Cubans have more of a West Coast presence, there has been, the field of Latinx studies has been kind of dominated by Chicanx studies, by studies of ethnic Mexicans, Mexican Americans, Mexican immigrants. And I think, one of the really exciting things for me being at Maryland is really understanding, right, the Latinidad is different in the DMV, right? Not just because of the geography of like what made the DMV what it is, but also the kind of community building, right? That's Salvadorans and Guatemalans, Hondureñas like established, right? And that although the field of Central American studies within Latinx studies has had a presence for over 20 years, it's still kind of on the margins, right? It's still very much, and when you read about Central Americans, it tends to be actually not in the DMV, right? Some of the kind of strongest work, like Cecilia Mancular wrote about San Francisco, studies about LA. Lecia Abrego just published, a year or 2 ago, a book that has roots kind of throughout the United States, but is not, it isn't about the DMV. And so to me, what's really exciting is that possibility, recognizing that we need to do more as a field to really mentor and learn from Central American experiences, right? And, Wanda Hernandez, who's a doctoral candidate in American Studies, is working on this. As someone who's grown up in the DMV, she's also deeply invested, right? So, but I think so that's one of the areas, Central American Studies as kind of more central to Latinx studies. And the other area that I find very exciting and necessary is grappling much more with indigeneity and Blackness and anti-indigeneity and anti-Blackness within our communities, right? Because I think for a long time, we just were like, we're all Latino, you know, we're all Latina. Like, yes, we come in different colors, but like, you know, isn't it amazing? And I think, you know, we're really in a moment where we have kind of back to your point, right? About being really aware of the power dynamics and the structures and the things that we don't want to talk about, right? The things where we can say, no, racism is something that other people do, you know, or maybe something that we experience, but not recognizing the ways in which we can ourselves and often do marginalize other groups, right? And deploy white supremacy and deploy anti-Blackness. So to me, those are like two areas that I think are really exciting and necessary.
Yeah, I think just to build off your really insightful comments, I think that, you know, one of the things that happens a lot in fields is, you know, to resist the kind of disciplining of a discipline, we try to remain kind of fresh and dynamic in the language that we use. And so I'm sure that, you know, we've been a part of different formations that have gone from being, you know, Chicano studies to Chicano studies, now to Chicanx studies, Latinx studies. And for me, in terms of thinking about anti-Blackness and indigeneity, BIPOC, this kind of term that has become more and more common in organizing spaces, also pushes us to think about questions of Blackness and indigeneity inside of, you know, particular communities, and just reminds us of how important it is to be vigilant about attending to questions of ethnicity as well, alongside questions of race and indigeneity, as well as gender and sexuality. And so I feel like, you know, just kind of constantly rehoning and making more precise the ways in which we engage in intersectional analysis in our work is something that the field is always trying to do.
If I could just give a shout out to Laura, one of the 2 or 3 most important things that I've read in the last couple of years, there are a trio of articles that came out in the panels of American geography.
Progress in human geography.
Progress in human geography on the relationship between settler colonialism and the Chicano movement and environmental movements, which I really, really highly recommend that people take a look at those pieces. They're just so informative and so generative to the conversation. The other thing I want to just sort of bring up in the context of this are the recent conversations about the canceling of Latinidad. Tatiana Flores, who's an art historian at Rutgers, has written a really provocative article called Canceling Latinx. Latinidad is canceled, yes, which has been like really exciting. And I would have put it in my syllabus this term, students, except I read it today. So, but really exciting stuff. I want to ask one more question and then maybe we'll open it up for conversation. So apropos of where the conversation has been going, I'm curious about the kinds of things that we'd like to see in the field, the kinds of conversations that we'd like to see emerging over the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe some examples of some work that you've seen that you think is really pushing that conversation.
Yeah. I am always making a pitch for people to start studying this, and that is the right and white supremacy. And this is something that within Latinx studies, I think we've been very hesitant to do. There's only a handful of people that are willing to take this on. I think of Cristina Beltran at NYU, Cecilia Marquez over at Duke. And I think this is incredibly important for us to study, both because of the way, of course, the entire nation, but especially including Latinx people are being impacted by this, especially immigrants, by the rise of white nationalism. We need to be studying up. We need to be studying this phenomena because it is totally, destroying the country as well as individuals. And we need to study within ourselves as well. And that's a very difficult, scary thing to do. I know, I've talked to people who have studied it, and I know, Jerry Cadana, right, who wrote his book on Hispanic Republicans, and I was talking about it. Are you going to keep studying this? He goes, oh no, I can't do it anymore. It was just like too difficult. And I mean, he wrote an amazing book, but you know, it takes it out of you, like that kind of work. So I think this is something we really, really need to be focusing on. In the case of Latino people, it's our investments oftentimes in the white nation that we espouse and we become part of the right, as well as sometimes some kind of, Christian formations as well, playing into that. So that's what I would be looking for.
Yeah, let me add to that just very quickly. I agree. I think one of the pitfalls sometimes we fall into as people of color or scholars of color is going too easy on ourselves, just kind of not really questioning what's actually happening. I think it's very easy to say like, oh, mi tío, he's just like the sus comentarios, like at the table, but like, how does your tío vote? What does that mean? Who does he harass? And I think that the real danger is in believing that as a country becomes more people of color, more Latinx, that of course we're going to be more progressive. I think, California, the entire table here knows, and most of you probably know, has this luster of being so progressive, but they eliminated bilingual education at some point. They eliminated fair housing. They have one of the largest prison populations. Like, just because you're a city, a county, a state that's majority people of color doesn't mean that you're automatically anti-racist or that you're working against white supremacy. So I think, whether it's studying the right or like our own, internal kind of prejudices and racisms and biases, I think we need to do a better job of like taking our communities to task.
I'll add to that. I think Perla made a couple of fabulous important points, but one of them I think in thinking about Central Americans that I'd like for us to think about is how the field is in such a tension between the idea of Latin American studies as area and development and then Latino studies as an ethnic studies project, and administrators still in 2022 do not understand the difference. There is a relationship, but they're also different. And so what we're finding now is, on one hand, always imagining Central Americans as migrants.
Yep.
When we have people from Central America who are back in Central America voting absentee for the president, right? Like, we need to up our game in terms of how we think about diasporic and international community.
Yes.
That is a very important point that I think often we fail to do. And I think because in many ways we've had folks from the social sciences that are culturalizing Latinos and Latinas and Latinx people in this country. We're not talking about racialization. We're making all of us ethnic. Then it becomes like this, we're just diverse, right? We may not talk about Bruno, but we're all diverse, right? Like, we have the Republican that we don't talk about, but we just get along. Can be racist because we're a mixture of races, right? And that reproduces this very troublesome idea. And so Latinos continue to be racialized in this country, and we have to think beyond this notion that we need to mark ourselves as exceptional, because we're not. We're part of the very same system that reproduces white supremacy.
Yeah, I'll, first of all, second everything that everyone said, because I think that, this is sort of where we are. I think maybe at some point, for all that we can sort of articulate wishes for the things that we'd like to see. I know that there's some graduate students in the audience, obviously some undergrads. It's going to be good to hear what you think, since you'll be taking over from us pretty soon. And this will be not up to you, I won't put it that way, but so certainly you'll be the one sort of driving the car at some point, and you should tell us where you want to go. But just to reiterate some of the things that have been said, I guess. I think we do need at this point to kind of, and whatever, partly it's because the field is where it is in its history. It's been around for decades now. So I think that there's a certain kind of maturity that comes with that. We're nowhere near as stable or as, I think we should have a larger presence in higher education and in the world at large. But I think we're healthy enough right now for better or worse, surprisingly or not, but to do this kind of work of self-interrogation and really looking deep within us for what we could be doing better, and not taking for granted that we somehow learned how to be more virtuous than everyone else. That's we're profoundly human and profoundly flawed, and our points of blindness are as sort of determinative of what we're doing and what we can and can't do than what our points of insight are. So I don't know if this. I feel like we do need to sort of open ourselves up for this larger space of a kind of cultural dimensionality that we're looking at sort of lives and breathes, but isn't so determined, right? That I think in Latino studies we still go back and forth, even just like this is going back to my first point on the question of language, and what we can study and what language we can study, and it's not just about sort of including more Spanish language stuff, which I think we need to do. But beyond that, the dyad of English and Spanish, include Portuguese, and include indigenous languages, and include, and again, not that we can all become practitioners of them, but I think that again, it just is a functional thing. If the only language that we're really functional in is one language, and say primarily English, but maybe we're only bilingual, right, in English and Spanish, that may be a thing that we want to. A number of years ago, I wrote a piece called Georgetown, which is about the Asian American fiction writer Georgetown, to find a way to sort of think about her Latinness, especially in a novel like Farming and Bones, which is set primarily in the DR, right? And the kind of the logics of inclusion, right, that make her a viable, her work a viable object of study for our field, right? It's stuff like that. The other place, and this is a really literary studies issue, is that so much of the way that we approached our project for decades really did hinge on this question of representation, of like how is Latinidad sort of forcing through the text that we're reading. But now we find ourselves encountering writers who are Latinx identified and who are being marketed that way, right? But who refuse that burden, refuse that task of representation, right? So it goes back and forth, and it's not perfect, but a really important example of this, because she's emergent, but she's quite major already, and she's an AU grad, is Carmen Maria Machado, right? Her Body and Other Parties is amazing collection of short stories. If you're looking for Latinidad in that text, you're going to have trouble finding it. It's there, but it's not just given. It's not the reason that it exists, even though it might be one of the ways it's marketed. So I think that's a particular thing. I think there's a larger sort of example of that for other disciplines besides literature and culture.
I'll just say a couple of things, and I'm so gratified and interested in the way that everybody chose to answer this question, because I was really thinking like thematically, right? Like what are some of the things that we might like to see discussed? So I'll actually throw out a couple of things that I have found really exciting. Some of the archival recovery work that's happened over the last decade or so, where people have gone back into the archive and found all kinds of interesting things that we didn't know existed, and that are very resonant with contemporary conversations. The novels by Lisa Burton and other people that are like very weird and interesting, and like, very much anticipatory of the kinds of conversations that we're having. The other thing, sort of at the other end of the spectrum, since I'm also a lit and culture guy, I have discovered like a rich body of these very weird and interesting contemporary visual texts. There's a guy called Vidal, who's a Puerto Rican visual artist who does these weird space astronaut things and like fake interviews that he does in the guise of an alien. And I think that these are like super interesting meditations on identity, what it's like to experience immigration, and like so many rich kind of conversations. So I think there's a lot of really, really contemporary work too that we just haven't thought about, because we're really focused on our own canons, right? And so like disrupting that process of canon formation that we ourselves are engaging in is also a really exciting project, right? At both ends of the historical spectrum. So I want to shut up now and invite conversation, questions, comments, anything that people have, especially if some of our students have things that they want to kind of chime in about. And for those of you that are currently enrolled in my LTS 200, we will be reading Carmen Maria Machado in a couple of weeks. So I just want to kind of put that out to you as well. So who has questions or comments?